The night air in Manchuria was colder than any winter that followed. A harsh frost coated the branches of the pine forest, and in the distance, the muffled sound of marching boots cut through the silence. A young guerrilla fighter named Kim Il-sung moved quietly between the trees, his breath mixing with the smoke of distant gunfire. He carried a rifle that had changed hands too many times, worn smooth by struggle. He was barely more than a boy, yet already a symbol to those who followed him. His soldiers watched him with a mixture of loyalty and expectation. The Japanese occupation seemed endless, but to Kim Il-sung, endurance was the only path to liberation. This is where the story of the North Korean state truly begins, not in the grand halls of Pyongyang, not in political speeches, but in frozen forests where survival itself felt like rebellion. And as the Japanese empire tightened its grip over Korea, a young Kim imprisoned in the memory of the past, promised that one day Korea would be free. The guerrilla raids were small, symbolic gestures, but in them grew the seeds of myth. Every victory, no matter how small, was passed between the guerrillas like a spark of hope. They watched Kim Il-sung move with calm certainty, even when rations dwindled and ammunition ran low. To his followers, he seemed to never hesitate. Years later, when the war ended and Japan surrendered, doors Kim Il-sung had never imagined suddenly opened. Soviet officers in long gray coats summoned him to their headquarters. The Red Army had swept through Manchuria, and with it came a new world order. The Soviet commander observed Kim's posture, the quiet discipline, the charisma. Here was someone they believed could stabilize the northern half of the peninsula. A man who spoke confidently, who inspired soldiers, who understood hardship. When Kim Il-sung entered Pyongyang for the first time, thousands filled the streets. Some cheered out of genuine excitement, others because liberation, any liberation, felt glorious after decades of occupation. He walked with a distinct step, slowly, deliberately, waving to crowds, knowing histories were being written in real time. The new government was molded quickly. Land reform. Nationalization. Speeches about unity, resilience, a nation reborn, but beneath the surface, the Korean peninsula was already splitting in two. In the south, Syngman rebuilt a government with American backing. In the north, Kim Il-sung shaped a state under Soviet protection. Two visions. Two ideologies. Two Koreas moving toward confrontation. As political tensions grew, Kim Il-sung began pushing a singular idea: unification under northern leadership. He met repeatedly with Soviet officials, trying to convince them that the South would collapse quickly. At first they hesitated. Yet Kim's confidence was relentless. When war finally erupted across the 38th parallel, North Korean troops surged south with stunning speed. Kim watched updates in his war room, surrounded by maps, radio operators, and generals whose loyalty bordered on devotion. The rapid advance fed a belief that unification was within reach. Seoul fell quickly. The war seemed decided, but the tides of war shift with brutal indifference. The United States intervened. The Pusan perimeter held. The Incheon landing shattered northern momentum. Kim Il-sung, who had spoken with certainty only weeks earlier, now stared at reports of retreat, loss, and collapse. Pyongyang fell. The government fled north. The myth of unstoppable victory was broken, yet when all seemed lost, China entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers poured into Korea, turning the conflict yet again. As winter returned, the front lines froze into a brutal stalemate. When the war ended in an armistice rather than a victory, Kim Il-sung stood before his nation knowing the dream of unification had slipped away. But he seized upon something else, the notion that North Korea had survived the combined forces of the world's strongest nations. This became the foundation of his rule. As rebuilding began, Kim Il-sung shaped the national ideology centered on himself. Factories rose from rubble. Propaganda painted him not simply as a leader, but as a father. Streets filled with murals depicting him as a protector. His speeches framed every hardship as a necessary sacrifice. The people listened, some convinced, some afraid, most exhausted by years of war, and in the background, a quiet shadow observed everything. His son, Kim Jong-il, watching his father's power grow, learning the rhythms of authority, memorizing the language of control. Kim Jong-il's childhood unfolded in the shadow of a myth. He grew up not as a typical child, but as the son of a man being transformed into a legend. In grand portraits, Kim Il-sung appeared taller, stronger, almost superhuman. Stories about his guerrilla exploits were retold with increasing exaggeration. For Kim Jong-il, these stories were not simply national tales, they were expectations. By the 1970s, he had risen into the center of the Workers' Party, shaping culture, propaganda, film, and ideology. He spoke softly, rarely raised his voice, yet commanded enormous influence. His interest in filmmaking led to some of the strangest episodes in the country's history, including the kidnapping of South Korean film director Shin Sang-ok. To Kim Jong-il, cinema was not entertainment, it was a tool for shaping the emotional landscape of an entire nation. When Kim Il-sung grew older, a transition of power began slowly, carefully, almost invisibly. Kim Jong-il attended every military parade, inspected factories, appeared beside generals. Citizens witnessed images of father and son together, not as equals, but as a line of succession presented as destiny. The system revolved around continuity. The people were taught that their future was the family they already knew. When Kim Il-sung died in 1994, grief tore through the streets. Citizens wailed in public squares. Some cried from genuine sorrow. Others from fear of not crying enough. Kim Jong-il watched this spectacle and understood that the image of his father would be the cornerstone of his own rule. The 1990s became one of the darkest periods in North Korean history. Floods destroyed crops. Economic collapse followed the fall of the Soviet Union. Famine swept across the countryside. Kim Jong-il adhered to military-first policy, strengthening the army even while citizens starved. Trains stopped running. Factories went silent. The people walked long distances searching for food. Entire villages slowly emptied. International aid groups reported suffering on a scale difficult to comprehend. Meanwhile, Kim Jong-il rarely appeared in public during this period, reinforcing his mysterious reputation. His inner circle tightened. He relied on loyal generals who surrounded him like a shield, yet the state survived. Through propaganda, military loyalty, and tight control over information, the government maintained its grip. And during these years, a young boy inside the royal family observed carefully. The future leader, Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un was educated in Switzerland under an assumed identity. His classmates recalled a quiet, introverted boy fascinated by basketball, computers, and American culture. But when he returned to North Korea, that world faded instantly. He was thrust into a system built on strict obedience. Every step he took was watched. Every word measured. His father began grooming him for power long before the public knew his name. When Kim Jong-il's health declined, Kim Jong-un emerged suddenly on the national stage, young, round-faced, styled deliberately to resemble his grandfather. The message was unmistakable. The legacy continues. When Kim Jong-il died in 2011, the nation again erupted in orchestrated mourning. Kim Jong-un stepped forward, surrounded by the same generals who had protected his father. At barely in his late 20s, he inherited one of the world's most secretive and militarized states. Kim Jong-un assumed power with an image of youthful uncertainty, but quickly demonstrated a ruthless decisiveness that shocked international observers. In his first years, several high-ranking officials disappeared from public life. Some were quietly removed. Others executed. Even his own uncle, Jang Song-thaek, once one of the most powerful figures in the country, was purged in a dramatic display of absolute authority. Kim Jong-un pushed aggressively toward nuclear capability. Tests intensified. International sanctions increased. The world watched with tension as North Korea launched missiles over the Pacific, conducted underground nuclear detonations, and issued bold declarations of deterrence. State television presented Kim Jong-un smiling confidently beside missile engineers, emphasizing strength, sovereignty, and defiance. Inside North Korea, infrastructure projects expanded. New housing districts, amusement parks, ski resorts, and monumental statues rose across Pyongyang. To the outside world, these projects seemed surreal given the country's economic challenges. But to Kim Jong-un, they symbolized modern identity and legitimacy. The internal propaganda machine elevated him into a figure that combined the traits of his father and grandfather, youthful energy paired with inherited destiny. His facial expressions, posture, and even haircut were shaped to evoke Kim Il-sung. Citizens noticed the resemblance, and the state magnified it. While the outside world perceived North Korea through the lens of threat and tension, everyday life inside the country continued in rigid patterns. Markets grew quietly despite restrictions. Smuggled USB drives from China circulated foreign media. In remote villages, electricity flickered inconsistently. In Pyongyang, privileged elites lived in modern high-rise apartments. The contrast within the country deepened, yet the central narrative remained firm: unity under the leadership of the Kim family. The moment that surprised the world came in 2018, when Kim Jong-un met South Korean President Moon Jae-in at the DMZ. Kim crossed the demarcation line with a hesitant but historic step. Cameras captured the handshake that seemed impossible for decades. Later, he met with U.S. President Donald Trump, the first ever meeting between leaders of the two nations. For a brief moment, global tension eased. Promises were exchanged. Symbolic gestures made. But the deeper issues remained unresolved, and as time passed, diplomacy slowed. Today, North Korea stands as one of the most isolated nations on Earth. The Kim family's rule spans nearly 8 decades, shaped by war, famine, ideology, secrecy, and unwavering control. Kim Jong-un leads with a blend of inherited mythology and modern ambition. The nuclear program continues. The nation remains closed. Yet the legacy of 3 generations defines its identity: past, present, and foreseeable future. The story of North Korea is not simply the story of its leaders. It is the story of a people navigating fear, loyalty, hope, and survival under a system built around one family. A system that began in the forests of Manchuria, took shape through war, endured through famine, and transformed through isolation, and in the silence of Pyongyang's wide boulevards, in the guarded compounds of the elite, in the distant mountains that border China, one truth echoes beneath the surface. The nights in Pyongyang had grown quieter over the years, but the silence carried a weight that felt heavier than any sound. Kim Jong-un stood on the balcony of the leadership residence, the city lights flickering below like distant embers. His grandfather once walked these same halls with a proud certainty. His father moved through them like a shadow, unseen and unreadable. Kim Jong-un, though young, carried both their burdens in his shoulders. The world around North Korea had changed. Technology advanced at a speed the state could not fully control. Satellites captured every new construction. International analysts examined every detail of missile engines shown in state broadcasts. Hidden beneath these images was a constant tension, a struggle between maintaining secrecy and projecting strength. Inside the country, the leadership circle remained small. Generals who pledged loyalty stood at attention during military inspections, their uniforms crisp, their expressions fixed. Officials walked cautiously in government corridors, measuring every word as though one misplaced sentence could alter their fate. The citizens continued their daily rituals, morning broadcasts, workplace meetings, long lines for supplies, all woven into a rhythm that had changed little over decades. Kim Jong-un's presence at official events evolved. At first, he appeared uncertain, carefully imitating the gestures of his father and grandfather. But gradually, he grew more assured. When he walked through factories, he placed a hand on a worker's shoulder the way his grandfather once had. When he watched missile launches, he smiled the sharp, controlled smile his father was known for. Each gesture a subtle message: the bloodline remains unbroken, yet privately, the challenges were immense. Sanctions pressed against the country like tightening walls. The economy inherited decades of strain. The leadership debated how much to reveal to the world and how much to conceal. In quiet rooms lit by dim lamps, advisors spoke in carefully chosen words, presenting reports on energy shortages, market activity, and border enforcement. Kim listened, tapping his finger against the table, a habit that signaled impatience to those who knew him. In rural villages, the changes were slower. Farmers worked rice paddies with the same methods their parents had used. Children walked miles to school along dirt paths. At night, families gathered around small battery-powered radios, listening to state music or patriotic stories. Many had never seen the world beyond their village, yet they repeated what they heard, that their nation was strong, their leader vigilant, and their history sacred. Along the northern borders, trade trickled quietly. Bags of rice. Chinese medicine. Small electronics. Goods moved through unofficial channels, a silent system that allowed families to survive in ways the government didn't acknowledge but tolerated carefully. Soldiers patrolled the hills, aware of every path, every movement, yet unable to stop every exchange. Within Pyongyang, the elite lived in a curated version of the country. Wide boulevards. Tall apartment towers. Theaters with grand red curtains. Students rehearsed synchronized dances in schoolyards. Banners praising the leadership hung across buildings. It was a world polished for television and foreign visitors, designed to reinforce an image of strength. Kim Jong-un's children, kept away from public eyes, grew under a system built around secrecy. Tutors watched them closely. Security escorted them everywhere. Their world was confined, but within the palace walls they heard stories of their grandfather and great-grandfather, stories that taught them not just history, but expectation. The dynasty's future would someday rest on them. As the years passed, North Korea continued to test missiles, some reaching higher altitudes, others flying across greater distances. Each test was presented by state media as evidence of national power. Engineers in white lab coats applauded. Soldiers cheered. Kim Jong-un observed with a calm, assured expression, surrounded by advisors who spoke only when spoken to. Outside observers questioned whether these displays were messages, negotiations, or warnings. Inside North Korea, they were reminders. The nation must remain vigilant. There were moments when hope flickered. Diplomatic meetings opened possibilities for dialogue. Delegates spoke politely across tables lined with microphones and flags. For a brief instant, the world imagined a different future, one without tension, one without fear. But these hopes often dimmed as quickly as they appeared, overtaken by mistrust, miscommunication, or geopolitical realities. Still, whispers of change moved quietly through the populace. Markets grew more organized. Young people watched foreign dramas in secret. Families connected with relatives in China through hidden phones. Ideas, once tightly contained, seeped slowly into corners of society, forming small cracks in the wall of isolation. Kim Jong-un, aware of the changes, pushed forward cautiously. He expanded certain industries. He modernized parts of Pyongyang. He allowed controlled tourism. But at every step, he ensured the state's grip remained firm. Too much change could fracture the system. Too little could suffocate it. The balance was delicate. On national holidays, the country transformed into a stage. Citizens marched in unison. Fireworks erupted above the Taedong River. Portraits of past leaders glowed brightly on building facades. Children waved flags in perfect rows. It was unity constructed through discipline, loyalty, and decades of carefully shaped identity. Kim Jong-un watched these displays with a thoughtful expression, understanding both their power and fragility, and through every year, every parade, every missile test, every diplomatic encounter, one future remained clear: the story of North Korea was still being written. Each generation of the Kim Dynasty shaped the nation according to its own fears, ambitions, and ideals. Kim Il-sung built the state in war. Kim Jong-il preserved it in hardship. Kim Jong-un guided it through isolation and modern pressure. The path ahead remained uncertain. The world waited. The region watched. The people endured. And somewhere in the quiet halls of Pyongyang, behind heavy curtains and guarded doors, decisions continued to shape the destiny of a nation unlike any other. A nation that began in frozen forests. A nation carried by myth and memory. A nation both feared and misunderstood. A nation bound to a family whose legacy presses forward through time.